The smell hit before the enemy did. Rotting flesh, baking under the July sun, sweet and cloying, mixed with the stench of 10,000 unwashed bodies packed into armor that hadn't been removed in 3 days. The flies were worse. Clouds of them, so thick you breathed them in with every gasp, drawn to the battlefield by the corpses from yesterday's skirmish that still lay bloating in the heat. The young archer from Yorkshire tried not to vomit inside his cheap iron helmet as he watched the French knights assembling across the field, their polished armor reflecting the merciless summer sun like 1,000 burning mirrors. His leather jerkin was already soaked through with sweat, chafing his skin raw. His water skin had been empty since dawn. He'd been marching for 6 weeks, eating moldy bread and dying of dysentery, and now he was about to face the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. This was medieval warfare. Not the gleaming spectacle Hollywood sold you, but a furnace of suffering where the sun killed as efficiently as any sword. You think you know medieval battles, the noble charges, the heroic duels, the glory of knights in shining armor. Every frame was a lie. The real medieval battlefield was a slaughterhouse operating under the summer sun, where disease killed 10 men for every one who fell in combat, where armor was a slow-cooking oven that roasted soldiers alive, and where the greatest tactical challenge wasn't defeating the enemy, it was preventing your own army from collapsing from heat stroke and dehydration before the fighting even started. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've held about medieval warfare, because the truth isn't noble. It's a nightmare of thirst, infection, and heat that turned men into corpses before a single sword was drawn. Let's start with the armor, because that's where the fantasy dies first. Picture yourself wearing 60 pounds of steel in 90-degree heat. Not for an hour, for an entire day. Now add a padded gambeson underneath thick quilted linen designed to absorb sword blows, which in summer became a wool blanket trapping every degree of body heat. Knights didn't glisten heroically in the sun. They cooked, slowly. The metal plates heated to temperatures that burned skin on contact. The padding underneath became soaked with sweat within minutes, adding another 15 pounds of waterlogged weight. Men regularly passed out inside their armor, and if they fell on their backs in full plate, they often couldn't rise without assistance, which, in the chaos of battle, meant death. The armor itself was beautiful, craftsmanship, yes, but it was also a mobile prison that limited vision to narrow slits, muffled all sound, and turned every breath into work. The full suit of plate armor cost as much as a small village, literally. We're talking about the annual income of a baron, or several years' earnings for a minor knight. This meant the vast majority of medieval armies wore little to nothing. Peasant levies, who made up 70-80% of most forces, might have a leather vest, maybe a cheap mail shirt if they were lucky, and a basic helmet. That's it. When you see movie battles with thousands of soldiers in gleaming plate, you're watching a fantasy that never existed. The reality was a small corps of expensively armored nobles, supported by a mass of nearly naked peasants holding spears, and in summer, even that small armored elite was compromised. Heat exhaustion didn't care about social class. A knight roasting inside 60 pounds of steel was just as vulnerable to sunstroke as any common soldier. But armor was just the beginning of the nightmare. Let's talk about how these armies actually assembled, because Hollywood's version of brave volunteers rallying to defend their homeland is pure fiction. Medieval English armies were built on feudal obligation, a fancy term for forced labor under threat of execution. Lords owed military service to the king based on how much land they held. They in turn forced their peasants to serve. The standard obligation was 40 days per year, but campaigns regularly lasted 6 months or more. What happened when your mandatory service ended but the war continued? You served anyway, because desertion meant confiscation of property, outlawing, or hanging. For a peasant pulled from his farm in June, conscription was a death sentence for his family. Who would bring in the harvest? Who would tend the animals? Medieval campaigns during summer farming season didn't just take men, they guaranteed starvation for the families left behind. The motivation for most soldiers was pure terror of punishment, not patriotism. Royal heralds would arrive in villages reading conscription orders. All able-bodied men report to the muster point or face severe penalties. Communities were forced to provide quotas of soldiers. The wealthy could pay substitutes to serve in their place, a system that ensured the poor did the dying while the rich stayed home.
Completely frozen.
And if you were
There's nothing we can do.
conscripted, you marched to war
We have
with
to
whatever
move.
you owned. No standardized equipment, no military-issued supplies, just whatever rusty spear or farming axe you could grab, whatever clothes you wore in the fields. The army that assembled was a mob of resentful, poorly equipped men who'd rather be anywhere else, commanded by nobles who viewed them as expendable meat to be thrown at the enemy. Now imagine this reluctant mob actually marching to war in summer heat. Hollywood shows you armies moving with crisp efficiency. Reality, 10 to 15 miles per day, maximum, often less. The roads, if you could call them that, turned to choking dust in dry weather, creating clouds that left soldiers gasping and coated in grime. In wet weather, they became rivers of mud that sucked boots off feet and turned wagon wheels into anchors. Soldiers marched in whatever they'd brought from home, which after a week in summer heat became stiff with dried sweat, stained with filth, and breeding grounds for lice. Your feet blistered, then the blisters burst and became infected. You kept walking on infected flesh because stopping meant being left behind, which meant death from exposure, starvation, or bandits. The logistics were catastrophic. An army of 10,000 men needed roughly 10 tons of food daily. In summer, that food spoiled within days in the heat. Bread grew moldy. Meat turned rancid. The water sources along the march route, rivers, streams, random wells, were contaminated by the army's own waste, as thousands of men relieved themselves upstream from where others drew drinking
Go ahead
water.
and click that bell icon
Dysentery
right
appeared
there to
within
stay
weeks,
updated on
spreading
our
through the
next
camp like
release.
wildfire. Soldiers developed bloody diarrhea, cramping, dehydration. They soiled themselves during the march because they couldn't control their bowels. In summer heat, this filth baked onto their skin and clothing, creating breeding grounds for disease. Medical understanding was non-existent. They blamed bad air or divine punishment, never connecting the obvious link between drinking downstream from your own latrines and getting sick. An army could lose a third of its strength to disease before fighting a single battle, and commanders simply accepted this as inevitable. The camp itself became a circle of hell during summer campaigns. Imagine 10,000 men packed into a temporary settlement with zero sanitation infrastructure, no toilets, no waste removal, no clean water. The summer sun beat down on canvas tents only for nobles. Common soldiers slept in the open, turning the camp into an oven that stank of human waste, rotting food scraps, and the horse manure from thousands of cavalry mounts. Flies descended in biblical swarms, so thick that eating meant consuming them with every bite. They laid eggs in food, in wounds, even in the mouths of sleeping men. Those eggs hatched into maggots that soldiers picked from their bread before eating it. This wasn't occasional, it was constant reality. Disease stalked through these camps like a visible predator. Typhus, spread by lice that infested every soldier's clothing and hair, caused high fever, delirium, and death within days. Scurvy appeared within weeks of campaign start. The diet of dried meat and hard bread contained no vitamin C. Soldiers' gums rotted, their teeth fell out, old wounds reopened spontaneously. Some simply dropped dead from internal bleeding, and dysentery, the camp plague, just kept killing. The death toll from disease dwarfed combat casualties by ratios of 5 to 1 or even 10 to 1. A commander who marched out with 10,000 men might have 6,000 left by the time he reached the battlefield, and of those survivors, perhaps half were weakened by illness, malnourished, and barely capable of fighting. But they fought anyway because turning back meant all that suffering was for nothing. The psychology was brutal. You've already lost half your comrades to disease. You're half starved and sick, but you've come this far, might as well see if the enemy kills you before the dysentery does. And then the battle itself, which bore zero resemblance to choreographed movie combat. The moment formations engaged, all tactical control evaporated. Yes, armies had plans. The English longbowmen would loose volleys to disrupt enemy formations, infantry would hold shield walls, cavalry would charge at decisive moments. Beautiful in theory. In practice, chaos. Once hand-to-hand combat began, you couldn't see beyond the men immediately surrounding you. Helmet slits limited vision to a narrow tunnel. The noise was overwhelming, not dramatic orchestral music, but a deafening cacophony of thousands of men screaming, metal clashing, horses shrieking, wounded crying for help. You couldn't hear orders. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse, and their words disappeared into the roar. Battle flags were supposed to coordinate movement, but in the dust and confusion, you couldn't see them. Battles disintegrated into thousands of individual fights, where soldiers simply tried to kill whoever was in front of them before being killed themselves. The summer heat made it exponentially worse. Men in armor fought for perhaps 20 minutes before heat exhaustion set in.
Body heat leaches into the frozen metal.
Some simply collapsed from heat stroke mid-battle, falling like puppets with cut strings. Their comrades had to drag them back or leave them to be trampled and killed. The smell was indescribable. Fresh blood has a coppery, almost sweet scent. Multiply that by thousands of wounded men. Add the stench of men losing bowel control from fear or death, the smell of horseblood and entrails, and the acrid smoke from any fires burning nearby. In summer heat, these smells intensified, creating a miasma that made men vomit inside their helmets, choking on their own sick while trying to fight. Getting wounded was often worse than dying quickly. Medieval medicine was barbarism masquerading as treatment. Army surgeons were frequently barbers whose medical training consisted of bloodletting and tooth extraction. Their toolkit, saws, cautery irons, heated red-hot in fires, and leather straps for patients to bite down on. Anesthesia didn't exist. If an arrow or sword strike shattered your arm or leg, amputation was the solution performed without painkillers while you were fully conscious and aware.
Forced labor
You'd be
in
held
hell.
down by several men, given wine or poppy extract that barely dulled the agony, and then have your limbs sawed off with the same tools used to cut firewood. The stump would be cauterized with red-hot iron to stop bleeding the smell of your own burning flesh mixing with your screams. Survival rate? Maybe 30%. Because infection killed most amputation patients within days. Even minor wounds became death sentences in summer heat. A shallow sword cut that might heal in cooler weather would fester within hours
Try
as
to
flies
sleep now.
laid eggs in the open wound.
Everything will be
By
fine.
the next day, maggots were eating infected
just need to
tissue.
hold on a little
Gangrene
longer.
set in the flesh around the wound, turning black, emitting a putrid smell that attracted more flies. If the infection spread, you died slowly and in agony as your body essentially rotted while you were still alive. The treatment was washing wounds with wine or vinegar, which had mild antiseptic properties but was nowhere near sufficient. Some surgeons used urine to clean wounds. The ammonia had slight antibacterial effects, but mostly this meant soldiers pissed on their wounded comrades' injuries and hoped for the best. The mortality rate from infected wounds was astronomical. A knight who
belong to the
survived the
Legion
battle
now,
might
boy.
die 2 weeks later from an infected scratch, delirious
run,
with fever as
and
his
you
blood
lose this
poisoned
hand.
itself. But let's say you survived the battle and the immediate aftermath. The psychological damage was permanent. Medieval society had no concept of PTSD, but the symptoms were identical to what modern combat veterans experience. Soldiers returned home with crippling insomnia, unable to sleep without reliving the screams of dying men. They startled at sudden sounds. They flew into uncontrollable rages over minor provocations. They couldn't bond with their families, couldn't explain what they'd experienced to people who hadn't been there. Some became violent, others withdrew completely, unable to function in civilian life. Medieval records are full of references to madmen wandering the countryside. Many were war veterans whose minds had broken under the strain of combat trauma. The summer campaigns were particularly destructive because the heat intensified every horror. Corpses rotted faster, creating visual and olfactory nightmares that seared themselves into soldiers' memories. The smell of death in summer heat, bodies bloating, bursting, liquefying, was something survivors could never forget. They'd smell something similar years later, a piece of meat left out too long in warm weather, and suddenly they'd be back on that battlefield, surrounded by the dead. The July sun beating down on fields of corpses, flies so thick they formed black clouds, the sweet rotten stench that clung to your nostrils for months afterward. These memories didn't fade. They haunted. And medieval society's answer was prayer, pilgrimage,
Hold
or
the line.
alcohol, none
Don't
of which
let them
addressed the
through.
fundamental psychological trauma. Many veterans lived out their remaining years as broken men, unable to rejoin the society they'd fought to defend,
Crenellation,
regarded with suspicion and
thermal
fear by the very
vulnerability.
communities they'd served. The aftermath of medieval battles destroyed the romantic myth entirely. Once the fighting stopped, the winners immediately began looting the dead and wounded. This wasn't frowned upon, it was expected, the primary way common soldiers received any compensation for their suffering. They'd move through the battlefield, stripping corpses of anything valuable: armor, weapons, clothes, boots, coins, jewelry. Wounded enemy soldiers were routinely killed during this process, not out of particular cruelty, but pure practicality. A wounded enemy might recover enough to stab you while you're looting his dead comrade. Better to slit his throat and move on. The summer heat meant this looting had to happen quickly before the body started decomposing. Within hours of battle's end in July heat, corpses would bloat and begin to rot, making the already grim work even more disgusting. Noble prisoners were kept alive for ransom. Capturing an enemy lord could make a common soldier wealthy for life. But peasant soldiers? Worthless. They'd be killed, enslaved, or at best stripped naked and left to find their own way home. The bodies of the dead were rarely buried properly. Most were left in mass graves, shallow pits hastily dug and filled, or simply left on the battlefield to be consumed by scavengers. Summer battles created particularly horrific scenes as the corpses rotted rapidly, creating disease risks for surrounding settlements. Entire villages near major battlefields would be abandoned as the stench became unbearable and plague spread from the decomposing bodies. So let's shatter the final myth, the idea that medieval warfare was about honor, glory, and noble combat. It was about survival in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. It was about marching through summer heat until your feet were bloody stumps, fighting disease that killed more efficiently than any enemy. And if you somehow survived to actual combat, experiencing minutes of pure chaos where you swung weapons blindly and hoped whoever you hit wasn't your own comrade. The armor wasn't protection, it was an oven that cooked you alive. The tactics weren't brilliant strategy, they were desperate attempts to impose order on fundamental chaos. And the aftermath wasn't glorious victory, it was looting corpses, watching wounded men die slowly from infected wounds, and carrying psychological scars that never healed. Hollywood lied to you about every single aspect. The real medieval battlefield was hell operating under the summer sun, where the heat itself was a weapon more deadly than any sword, where disease was the true enemy, and where survival was less about skill and pure luck. The knights in shining armor? Most died of dysentery before they ever lowered a lance. That's the truth the movies will never show you. The romantic myth of medieval warfare dies hard, but it needs to die. Because every time we glorify the honor of medieval combat, we erase the suffering of the thousands who were forced into service, who marched until their bodies broke, who died slowly of infected wounds or quickly of heat stroke, and whose names history never bothered recording. They weren't heroes. They were victims of a system that treated human life as disposable fuel for aristocratic ambitions. The next time you watch a movie battle with gleaming armor and heroic charges, remember the reality. The smell of rotting corpses in summer heat, the flies laying eggs in open wounds, the screams of men having limbs amputated without anesthesia, and the thousands who died of dysentery in shit-filled camps before ever seeing combat. What shocked you most? The disease statistics, the primitive surgery, the fact that armor was more danger than protection in summer? Share your thoughts below. And if you want more brutal historical truths that shatter popular myths, subscribe to Flow of History and hit that notification bell. Our next video exposes an even darker aspect of medieval life, something that makes warfare look merciful by comparison. Trust me, you won't believe what we've uncovered.